a moment from the past knighthood. Asilah had not yet been conquered when the men began to renovate the main mosque. Everything appeared to have been tossed out of it except the walls, where the adornments that still decorated them were one of the few reminders that it had once been a mosque. Outside, the distinguishable minarets still towered overhead. Now, imported or hastily made crucifixes were hung on the walls of the former mosque, and icons were placed in the spaces between windows. Benches were placed between the entrance to the temple and a wooden altar that had been brought along from Lagos. A path was laid out in the passage. By the evening, a priest had consecrated the temple. On the eve of knighthood for the heir to the throne, Joao prepared for his Accolade. He bathed, put on a white shirt, and over it, a scarlet cape. His boots were decorated with gold spurs. All night he stood at the altar with his head down, praying, and tried not to listen to the screams of the soldiers coming from outside. The following afternoon, Joao stood for Mass, offered confession, and received communion. Finally, the initiation began. King Afonso V of Portugal, father of Joao, girded him with a sword, and Father Pedro, who had accompanied the army, put his hands on the young man's shoulders. Joao felt the eyes of those witnessing the ceremony on his back. Among them were the nobles who accompanied the king on the campaign, Don Daniel, who captured the fortress gates, Duke de Braganza, whose detachment was the first to break into the fortress and who saved his life, and Fernao Gomes, a navigator and assistant to the king who had made multiple trips to African shores. Gomez's face was disfigured by a terrible wound, and the torn and stitched cheek continued to bleed. At the end of the ceremonial speech, Father Pedro removed his hands from Joao's shoulders and solemnly said,
"My son, you are now knighted."
Then the king himself spoke. He put an ancient sword on his son's shoulder. It was a sword of Damascus steel with a handle so richly decorated with rubies that it seemed to be made only of these gems and nothing else. Previously, this sword belonged to the Vizier Shadullah, the now defeated commander of the Muslim army. After paying tribute to his son's bravery and his art of winning victories, the king entreated him to devote his life to protecting his native land from infidels and troublemakers. Finally, the king said,
"And trust, my son, only your friends."
"Who are they, our friends?"
Joao asked unexpectedly to everyone. The king looked confused. It did not immediately occur to him that Joao was dead tired from the fight the day before, then the night spent on his feet at the altar, and finally from the excitement associated with his knighting. Afonso nodded at the guests at the ceremony.
"Your friends,"
the king explained,
"are those you trust and those who trust you."
And with an iron-gloved palm, the king pointed at the guests. However, this hint did not seem to reach the tired Joao. Joao looked at the sword that had just been presented to him. The rubies on the hilt sparkled in the rays of the sun that invaded through the small windows. He raised the sword above his head and said,
"Here, Father, is my friend whom I trust, and let those who will trust it, who will trust everything it does, find me themselves. They will be my friends and friends of Portugal."
The young Joao had not yet learned how to express himself in such a way that his words were understandable to those around him, and not only to him alone. Judging by the faces of the king and the guests, they failed to understand him now. Only one person among those standing at the altar understood him correctly. Haste was imperative. It was going to be necessary to select people and place them in the king's entourage and in the cortege quickly, because the day Joao was named king, hard times would come for him, for this man. Chapter 13. Chimalli and the King.
"Aren't you late, senors?"
Joao II said as three navigators entered his office in the tower of the castle of St. George and began to bow. One of them, Bartolomeu Dias, straightened up and was about to open his mouth and say something when a bell rang.
"You're not too late."
The king grinned.
"Well, come in and get acquainted."
Bartholomew, Christopher Columbus, and Vasco da Gama came to the table. The king was sitting at the head of it, and at the other end, they noticed a swarthy, half-naked man of about 50 years of age in unusual clothes. His head, arms, and body were decorated with gold chains, earrings, rings, and tattoos. On his face, ears, and nose there were traces left by previous adornments. There was a dish of roast beef in front of the strange-looking man, and he ate it with an appetite. Two people rose from their seats on the other side of the table, an elderly sailor, with whom Bartolomeu Dias was already familiar, and a young monk in a wool shirt. The sailor's face was disfigured by a terrible scar on his cheek. A blissful smile was playing on the monk's face.
Fernao Gomes.
The king introduced the sailor. Gomes politely bowed to the newcomers. The king rang the bell. The servants entered the study. They held trays of dishes and filled jugs in their hands, which they began to put on the table near the plates that had been placed in advance.
You may be acquainted with this gentleman.
The king continued. Dias nodded.
Fernao Gomes is a brave navigator who is currently exploring the African coast. Every year, he travels another 100 leagues to the south and brings back new curiosities, and most importantly, the maps. These maps show native settlements and places where valuables can be mined.
I am glad to meet such wonderful gentlemen, of whom I have already heard a great deal.
Gomes said to the new guests of the king. His speech was unusual and not quite clear. It was distorted by the wound that disfigured his cheek, but it seemed that Gomes was not at all shy about it.
I would like to introduce my son Pascoal to you. Pascoal decided to link his fate with God and not with long voyages. He is a novice of the Jeronimos monastery in Lisbon, founded as you know by our great Henry the Navigator, but currently he is serving in the Church of Leiria.
Pascoal's smile stretched across his face and nodded.
Fortunately he still tries to help me.
Gomes continued.
He already knows a lot of foreign languages. With his help, I am able to talk to foreign sailors, merchants, and scientists that may visit our ports, as well as foreigners who work for me here in Portugal or are engaged in long-distance campaigns. The other day, one of these foreigners mysteriously ended up in the hands of soldiers who serve in the fortress of Leiria, and Pascoal brought this wonderful man here.
Gomes pointed to the guest in the unusual dress.
His name is Chimalli.
Hearing his name, Chimalli stopped eating and looked curiously at the king's guests.
What country did he come from?
Vasco da Gama asked.
That's the thing,
Gomes exclaimed,
that we haven't been able to find out yet.
Sit down, senors, and share our meal.
The king addressed the captains. They took their places at the table with bows.
I have met many foreigners, both on the shores of different countries and at sea.
Gomes continued.
I have traveled all over Europe and all the coastal countries that our ships have ever reached. I have talked to travelers who have visited China, India, and some of the hottest desert countries in the world. From these people, I learned what the natives of these countries look like and how they behave. But he,
and Gomes pointed to Chimalli,
did not come from these countries. That's the only thing we've been able to ascertain for sure. He came from a country that is still unknown to us. His country is not yet in the Achaemen.
All the navigators looked at Chimalli. This time he was clearly abashed. Now Pascoal took the floor.
He appeared in the forest near Leiria, on the high road by the seashore in the middle of the night.
He added to his father's story with a smile. The navigators exchanged glances.
My son Centaurs,
Gomes continued,
hints at rumors about the Red Coast that supposedly prowls the coastal areas, commits murders, and commits other outrages there. Such rumors appear among the people from year to year, and always, as you know, it turns out to be only hearsay. Unless the dark crowd delegates some unfortunate person as the host and then woe to him.
Fernao noticed how cautiously the navigators were examining Chimalli. The alien's skin really had a copper-red hue, and his dress, crumpled and soiled by all his troubles, still retained a somewhat red color. Fernao laughed.
No, centaurs, Chimalli is not a host at all. He's a traveler, and Pascoal brought him here from Lyria.
Joao II did not take his eyes off Fernao Gomes, and judging by his face, the king did not like this turn in the narrative very much. He obviously knew about something related to these stupid rumors, but he didn't say it out loud.
You centaurs may ask why our traveler ended up here, in His Majesty's palace. Take a look at his jewelry, its appearance does not deceive you. It is really made of gold and precious stones.
Of the gold Portugal needs so much today.
The king saw fit to add.
Go on, Gomez.
Thank you, Your Majesty. This man centaurs does not value gold as high as our jewelers and money changers appreciate it. In truth, they are valuable to him only because they do not rust and always shine. However, iron is not known in his homeland, and he says that it would be more valuable than gold because there is an abundance of gold there, but there is no iron at all. Surely you understand what kind of profit such an exchange promises?
The navigators were silent. The news stunned them. If Fernao had told anyone about this elsewhere, they would have considered him crazy. However, he said all this in the presence of the king, in the presence of a savage hung with gold, and his son who brought this savage.
His Majesty the King agrees with my proposal to equip ships and sail to the homeland of this Chimalli,
continued Fernao Gomes.
Of course, those that brave this voyage will be generously rewarded.
But what direction exactly will these ships go?
Vasco da Gama asked.
We don't know that yet.
The smiling Pascoal said again.
We only know that it's impossible to get there by land. The homeland of this man is beyond the sea on which he sailed.
Why do you think that?
Vasco da Gama asked.
When I asked him how he ended up in the forest, he pronounced the word Adel in his language, which means water, but there are no lakes or rivers where he ended up, just as there are no places in Portugal that would be inhabited by such a people.
So he means the ocean?
Dias suggested.
I think so.
Pascoal nodded.
Try to ask him from which part of his Adel he sailed.
The king addressed the navigators.
And Pascoal will try to translate.
Does he know such words as India, Africa, Europe, or China?
Columbus asked.
No. Maybe he knows of these lands, but he doesn't know such words.
Pascoal replied.
Sometimes he pronounces the word Aztlan. Maybe that's the name of the land from which he came.
Aztlan,
said Dias, looking incredulously at Pascoal and Chimalli.
Aztlan. And what is north, south, west, east does he know?
Surprisingly, he knows.
Pascoal said.
Despite his appearance, he is a very knowledgeable person, but he identifies the cardinal directions differently. First, they bear the names of animals or objects. Second, they are located close to our cardinal directions but do not exactly coincide with them. He draws a circle, but I still don't understand how exactly to discern the landmark within this circle, and without that, it is impossible to understand the connection between their directions and ours.
I see that he doesn't use utensils and eats with his hands.
Columbus said.
It's amazing for a man with such wealth as he has. Oh yes, pardon me, but his clothes and jewelry are still quite skillfully made. Do they really belong to him?
I forgot to mention that he also knows the beginnings of mathematics. As for the clothes, I'll try to ask him now.
Pascoal opened the bag he always carried with him and took out a pile of papers covered with drawings, geometric shapes, numbers, and lots of dots and lines. Finding the images of the dress and necklace, he showed them to Chimalli and looked at him questioningly.
Tikiatl.
Chimalli answered.
Tikiatl? Me amo asakamati. I don't understand you.
Kima, Tikiatl.
Chimalli said. He took the gnawed bone from his plate and put it next to Pascoal's plate, and then took a piece of bread from Pascoal and moved it to his own plate. Having done this, he looked directly at Pascoal.
Trade.
Pascoal guessed.
Tikiatl means trade. Tuatl Tikiatl Aztlan, did you trade it in Aztlan?
Kima.
Chimalli agreed.
He says he bought or exchanged this dress in his homeland.
Pascoal declared. He immediately took a quill out of his bag and wrote down the new word.
Now we know that the Aztlan people make the things they need and trade them.
Bartolomeu Dias said.
So, our iron can also be exchanged, Tequila, for gold.
Ask him how long he sailed to get to our land from his.
Columbus asked.
Can you Atlan? How long did you sail to our land?
Pascoal asked Chimalli. Chimalli got up and walked over to the dish on which the forks, new to Portugal, were lying. He took 5 forks to Pascoal and laid them out on the table in a row. Pascoal rummaged through the papers, found a sheet covered with lines and dots, and poked his finger at one of the drawings.
Iloidal?
Kima.
Chimalli agreed.
He says 25 days.
Pascoal translated.
1 fork equals 5 days.
Columbus was surprised.
Did he have lunch once every 5 days?
Pascoal burst into silver laughter, but, glancing at the king, stopped.
No, Senior Captain. 1 line is 5. If you are interested, 1 dot means 1. 5 dots are replaced with 1 line. 5 lines will be 25. Iloidal means day.
Suddenly Chimalli walked over to the king. The king and everyone sitting jumped up from their seats. Fernao wanted to grab his sword but remembered that he had handed it over to the guards. Without thinking twice, he rushed to Chimalli to stop him. However, Chimalli only took 2 peas from the king's plate and then carried them back. He put them next to the forks, looked at Pascoal, and trembled when he saw the reflection of the act on the monk's face.
Sempwali chicum illidal.
He pronounced embarrassed.
27 days.
Pascoal translated, returning to his senses. Everyone was silent. The king sat down again and pushed the plate of food away from him.
Go on,
he said to the guests.
Did he come alone?
Columbus asked. All the Europeans present laughed, but Columbus continued.
You understood me correctly. I want to ask, where is his ship? Where are the other voyagers?
I asked him about it before.
Pascoal said.
I have not yet learned the language of this stranger very well. It is hard to believe what I have learned from him so far. From what I have understood, he says they live in a city called Accolade. He says that this city is inhabited by more than 1,000 people and is located very close to our shore. When I asked him to draw his city, he drew this.
And Pascoal put a strange drawing on the table that depicted 2 large ships with some kind of pyramidic structure between them. At the same time, the drawing did not show any of the most indispensable parts of a ship such as masts and rigging.
It still looks like a ship, not a city with houses or town streets.
Vasco da Gama said, looking at the drawing.
How did they know which way to sail?
Dias asked.
How did they navigate their directions?
Pascoal rummaged through the papers again. He showed Chimalli one drawing and then another, asking him questions, sometimes drawing or just crossing something out. Finally, Pascoal raised his head and solemnly said,
He says they were going toward the sunrise.
Wait!
Columbus said loudly. He walked over to a dish of finger foods, took an egg from it, and showed it to Chimalli.
Tell him that the egg is the sun, and this table is the sea.
Pascoal translated the words of the navigator for Chimalli. Columbus hid his hand with the egg under the table, waited, and then slowly began to raise it. When the egg rose above the table, Columbus looked questioningly at Chimalli. Chimalli pointed to the egg with his hand and said,
Toneshu Tliko. Sunrise.
Unbelievable. This can't be happening.
Exclaimed Columbus.
Explain yourself,
said the king.
Certainly.
Columbus recklessly scooped up some of the dishes. At the same time, a piece of meat fell to the floor which Chimalli looked at with regret. After looking at the others, he decided not to pick it up. Columbus pulled a paper folded several times out of an immense pocket and spread it out on the table.
I've been working on this map for years, and it's not finished yet. Here.
Columbus took one of the forks and placed its middle in the center of Portugal, crossing the Iberian Peninsula with the handle. The pointed half of the fork went beyond its borders, the teeth pointing to the left of the land, past the coast of Portugal. Columbus took the egg and placed it near the blunt end of the fork that lay in Genoa, Columbus' hometown.
In May,
Columbus explained, pointing at the egg.
The sun rises around here, and if what he says is true, it means that he sailed from over there.
And Columbus covered the expanse of the big ocean with his palm, the direction of the pointing prongs of the fork, and which no navigator had yet dared to sail. Everyone stared at his outstretched hand.
Over there,
Columbus explained, pointing to the window behind the king. From the westward-facing window, one could see the mouth of the Tagus River flowing into the sea. Columbus removed his palm from the map. Below it was a picture of the sea, dotted with groups of points. To the west of Portugal, the Azores were visible on this map.
You yourself said a few days ago that you wanted to go that direction to get to India.
The king said to Columbus.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Columbus nodded. Fernao Gomes, who had been standing a little to one side all this time, smiled and said,
Your Majesty, I think I can guess who will lead the next voyage in that direction.
The king stood at the window, looked at the caravels headed out of the Tagus toward the sea, paused, then said,
And yet I do not know how much one can trust this savage. To get to our shore on a boat without sails with 1,000 people. What kind of ship can this be? Even galleys, rowing vessels, and such have sails. The captains of the carracks, who guard us against attacks by sea, did not report the approach of any large ships toward Portugal, and if this ship is so big, it would have definitely been noticed and reported immediately.
The king squinted at the fork, which was still pointing west.
Besides, we also must not forget the circumstances under which our soldiers caught this crazy old man. In the vicinity of Leiria, several strange incidents have occurred in recent days. One soldier from the mounted patrol was killed, and the second soldier, his partner, disappeared. An attack was made on a military convoy, and its guards also disappeared without a trace. Maybe it's a bunch of crazy people? Isn't our guest, who walks through the forest at night, is covered with gold, and steals food from the king's dish right in front of his eyes, quite possibly crazy? Or maybe this madman just doesn't want to go back to prison. He sits here, eats, and drinks from the royal table, and comes up with one fairy tale after another?
The navigators looked at each other anxiously. They didn't know about these incidents.
But if he really got here by sea, then I am primarily concerned about a ship that sailed unnoticed to the shores of Portugal. Of course, I am also worried about bandits in the vicinity of Leiria, who may be killing and kidnapping my soldiers. Yes, and this red ghost, from which there is always no rest. We need to figure out if these are separate events, or if they are related.
The king paused and stared at the landscape outside the window again. The king's guests were also silent. Brother Pascoal and Chimalli exchanged glances and smiled.
Give me time to think.
The king finally broke the silence.
I'll call on you again. Everyone can go.
Through the window, the king saw a horseman riding through the castle gate. Judging by the horse, it was a messenger. One could only hope that he brought good news. The king's expectations were justified. A messenger brought news. General Afonso was leading his garrison back to Lisbon, and the garrison of the Vila Vicosa castle had joined the ranks. An army of 800 men was approaching Lisbon. Thus, the first fruits of this bloodless conquest were already in his hands. The personal garrison of Duke de Braganza, who had previously defended the castle at Vila Vicosa. The king would send the garrison of de Braganza to the south to help other detachments in the Algarve, and he himself would visit Vila Vicosa in the near future and confiscate everything of value from there.